Well, I'd like to thank you again just for the opportunity of coming and sharing from God's Word with you again this morning. It's wonderful to be able to come on a beautiful day like this. I know as we move further north, it looks like the showers of blessing are going to come to us before we get too much further. But it's been a wonderful start to our day, and we can be thankful for the Sabbath. I'm going to invite you now just to bow your heads again as we invite the Lord's presence to be here with us. Our dear Heavenly Father, we take it as a real privilege again this morning to come into this house of worship. And we know, Lord, that as we spend this time together, that your presence will be here with each and every person with head bowed. So be with us now as we open your word. Help us to understand the wonderful promises and the hope that it gives to each and every one of us. And we ask and pray these things in thy precious name. Amen. You know, there's a common saying that's been passed down from ancient times and from generation to generation that says it is always darkest before the dawn. Well, in reality, there's very little evidence for that belief. But because we always judge the darkness before dawn by the dawn itself, it is this comparison that makes us realise how dark it was before. In 1940, the British people were to go through one of the darkest and blackest periods of their long history. And this was to take place during the Second World War after the rescue of 339,000 officers and men from the beaches of Dunkirk. And under constant fire, private yachts and barges and pleasure steamers, tugs and vessels of all sorts and sizes worked their way back and forth across the English Channel as the soldiers were brought to safety. And this was to be seen as one of those special times that showed human nature at its most valiant. And this event was also known by secular historians as the miracle of Dunkirk. Officers and men had seen the hand of God at work, and it would seem that the prayers of a nation had been answered. However, it was after this episode, in August and September of that same year, that all the might of the German war machine was thrown against the British forces in the air, and this was to be called the Battle of Britain. And Winston Churchill was to make the comment that never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. You know, it was the courage, the endurance, and the dogged determination of the young British and Allied fighter pilots that eventually saw Britain gain a momentous victory. And this was seen by historians to be one of the major turning points of the war. The dawn of peace was believed to be just around the corner. And when V-Day eventually came, the relief that was felt by the peoples of war-torn Europe would have been very difficult to put into mere words. As those involved in this very disastrous conflict were to look back on these years and contrast them with the years that were to lie ahead, the dawn of a new post-war era must have looked pretty good to each and every one of them. Dear friends, ever since the beginning of time, this old world has been through many such experiences, but never as great and as momentous as those periods that have been faithfully described in the Scriptures. And these events stand out because of the eternal consequences that were to be involved. Well, I want you to picture with me this morning one of the most dramatic moments that was to take place in that newly created garden paradise that God in his love had provided for the inhabitants of this world. The world's most beautiful woman, created perfect, without blemish, was to face one of the greatest tests of her short existence. Created as a companion for the man, bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh, this wondrous creature was to come up against one of the mightiest and intelligent of God's creation. An angel who had once held the highest position in heaven, next to Jesus himself. A being whom God had created a little higher than the inhabitants of this new world. When Eve made that fatal mistake to listen to the words of this created being above the words of God, and then persuaded Adam to do the same, the world was thrown into instant confusion as death now becomes an intruder into the creation story. Author Ellen White tells us in Desire of Ages, page 62, that Adam and Eve, in witnessing the first sign of decay in the drooping flower and the falling leaf, mourned more deeply than those who now mourn over their dead. This was to be a dark, dark day in the annals of biblical history. The following tragic consequences were not only to include shame and suffering and estrangement, but also flight from God, disharmony, and deepening disillusionment. All heaven was filled with sorrow, and we are told that the angels ceased their songs of praise, and there was only mourning for the ruin that its sin had brought upon the earth. Was this to be the end? How was God to deal with this very tragic situation? You know, to all of heaven and the worlds that were looking on, what appeared to be the darkest hour in Earth's very short history was soon to be dispelled by one of the most extraordinary revelations given by God himself. God was to make it very clear that his plan for man's salvation was now to involve all heaven in its infinite sacrifice. The angels were to be told it would now cost the life of their beloved commander, and there could be no other way. The Son of God would now have to come in contact with the degradation of this earth and endure shame and sorrow and death. At the end of Christ's mission, he would be placed into the hands of wicked men to suffer insult and torture. Jesus would wear the weight of the sins of the whole world on his shoulders, and to accomplish this plan, he was to be made a little lower than the angels to prepare for the suffering of death. You know, the scriptures tell us that this incredible plan had already been laid before the creation of the earth. For we are told in Revelation 13:8 that Christ was to be the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. You know, what seemed to be at one brief moment only despair and discouragement was now to open up to some of the most wonderful promises involving hope and the prospect of a new life. As soon as the angels realised that through the death of Jesus, many on earth would be saved and that the one who had the power of death would finally be destroyed, there was inexpressible joy in heaven. And as noted in Job chapter 38 verse 7, the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. It would seem that the concept of a world redeemed was to outweigh the anguish and sacrifice of the Prince of Life. The first that Adam and Eve knew of this plan was the announcement made in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. And it was here that the Lord himself declared to the serpent, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed, that's the offspring, and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. In other words, that's saying, I will put hatred between you and the woman, and between your descendants and her descendants. It'll bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. You know, this statement was effectively a declaration of war. It was also declared that the power of this mighty fallen angel would eventually be broken. What had seemed so dark with despair only moments before was now opened up to the glorious light of a new dawn. Hope was given where it seemed that hope was not to be found. The price was high, but this plan was to reveal once again the deep and mysterious love that God has for all of his created beings, for you and for me. A love, the scriptures tell us, that passes all knowledge. And this was to be one of the mysteries of God, the plan of redemption. You know, since the fall, there have been many periods of crisis where the world was to be plunged into dark times, where the light of God was to be almost extinguished. And these were times when Satan had set out to challenge the very power of the God of heaven. And these challenges were seen in the time before the flood, during the exodus of Israel from Egypt, and the challenge given to the priests of Baal on the top of Mount Carmel. Dear friends, this was spiritual warfare. This morning, however, I'd like to focus on what could be considered to be one of the longest and darkest periods of Earth's history. A time that was to begin just before the birth of Jesus Christ, and which was to culminate initially in the rise of the Protestant Reformation, and finally end with the French Revolution in 1798. It was then that God's prophetic clock was to toll on time, marking the dawn of a new short era of so-called spiritual liberation for this old world. And to understand the background to this particular section of history, we need to turn to the scriptures and to read the words of Jesus as given through the Apostle John in the book of Revelation, chapter 12, verses 1 to 6, and then verses 13 to 17. Let us read what he had to say. We're looking at Revelation, chapter 12, and verses 1 to 6, and then we'll look at verses 13 to 17. Now, verse 1 tells us that a great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. Verse 2 says, she was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. You know, this radiant woman, clothed with the glory of God, represented what? It represented the church of the Old and the New Testament. Faithful people throughout all ages. And it was to be through this chosen vessel that Jesus Christ was to come in the flesh. Now, we need to recognise that the world prior to the birth of Jesus had become more and more degraded throughout the long ages of sin, and now more than ever was calling out for the coming of the Redeemer. And as the time drew near, Satan was to redouble his efforts to extinguish not only man's love for God, but also God's love for man. Let me tell you, the world was in a mess. Verse 3 and 4. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his heads. His tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. And the dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that he might devour her child the moment it was born. Dear friends, these verses identify the dragon as that old serpent, the devil, Satan, that mighty angel, the deceiver, not only of the angels, but also of the whole world. The woman now stands in peril of the dragon, as he stands poised to attack her when she's about to give birth. The description of the child leaves us in no doubt that this event referred to the birth of the commander of heaven. Satan had done everything possible in the Old Testament times to break this very thin strand of Christ's lineage through God's chosen people. And while many times this had almost reached breaking point, It had faithfully been protected and preserved by God himself. The birth of Jesus, dear friends, was to come on time. And we find this event recorded in the book of Galatians chapter 4 and verses 4 and 5, where it says, "When the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son." God sent forth his Son. The fullness of time had come, and Satan was now to marshal the full extent of his forces. And as history records, the arch-deceiver was to use one of the most debased men of his time to carry out his purposes. Herod the Great at that time was governor of Judea, and he was known for being a ruthless fighter, a cunning negotiator, and a subtle diplomat. He was a loyal supporter of the Emperor of Rome and an important figure in the life of the Palestinian Jews. His policies were implemented with force and cruelty, and it was to be his overwhelming fear of a Jewish revolt that led him to become paranoid over the protection of his throne. With 10 marriages and 15 children, he was virtually guaranteed that there would be some major struggles over who would be his successor. Herod's murder of his own wife, Mariamne I, and 2 of his sons led to the well-known statement, "It's better to be one of Herod's hogs than to be one of his sons." Better to be one of Herod's hogs than to be one of his sons. And it was at this time that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and the wise men came asking, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews?" Well, you could just imagine how Herod responded to this piece of news. Let's read his story. We're looking at Matthew chapter 2 and verses 1 to 3. And then we're going to look at verses 7 and 8. And then we're going to look at verses 12 to 18. So we're looking at Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, first of all. And then we'll look at verse 7 and verse 8, and then 12 to 18. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east, and we have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Let's come to verses 7 and 8. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and he said, "You go and make a careful search for the child, and as soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." Let's come now down to verses 12 to 18. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take that child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod's going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up and took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realised that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. And he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. And then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping, in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted, because they are no more." Because they are no more. It's a sad thing when we look at what was happening at that time in Judea. It was an horrific attempt, a desperate attempt by the dragon. In verse 5, we're looking now back at Revelation 12 and verse 5. She gave birth to a son, a male child who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter, and her child was snatched up to God and the throne. And fortunately, the devil's power was not strong enough to thwart the eternal purposes of God. The Son of God was destined to rule all nations with a rod of iron. In verse 5, the Apostle John now takes us from these dramatic events, passing silently over the period of the life and ministry of Jesus, directly to his ascension. Now, Revelation 12:5 was to cover 33 years of history. Jesus is now back in the presence of his Father. Well, what would be the dragon's next move? Let's read Revelation 12, and we're looking now at verses 13 to 16. Verse 13 says this: When the dragon saw that he'd been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle so she might fly to the place prepared for her in the desert, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time, out of the serpent's reach. Verse 15, Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river, to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. You know, these 4 verses were now to cover a period of 1260 years, finishing in 1798. A huge sweep of history that, for a number of reasons, would be for the most part called by secular historians as the Dark Ages. Being unable to attack the Son of God directly, the dragon now turns all of his anger on the woman. Satan's persecution of the church, God's faithful people, was described as a flood of destruction that would increase from century to century. It was estimated that 50 million people died for their faith during that particular period. The devil was determined to wipe out and destroy to the last man and woman anyone who continued the true worship of the God of heaven. However, during this period, until the end of the 1260 years in 1798, at the time of the French Revolution, God was to provide shelter and nourishment in the remote wilderness areas of the earth. And these events have been faithfully recorded in the history of nations for everyone to see, and were to fulfill the words described in verse 16. But let me tell you, the story does not end there. While the Protestant Reformation was in part to bring release from the devil's hold over the truth and accessibility of the Scriptures, he was now to intensify his campaign to destroy the people of God. And this was particularly the case for the remnant of her seed that were to keep the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. Let's read verse 17. It says there that then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to make war against the rest of her offspring, those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Now, this was to take the world through a time of trouble such as never been seen before. Dear friends, we're living in that time that the Bible calls the time of the end. This commenced according to God's prophetic timeline in the year 1798, and it now leads us towards the glorious second coming of Jesus Christ. The dragon would concentrate now all of his efforts on the woman's descendants, those who keep the commandments of God. From 1798, approximately 46 years later, in December 1844, the all-powerful God of the universe, who often chooses the weak things of the world to shame the strong, was about to take a sickly 17-year-old girl by the name of Ellen Harmon into the very courts of heaven. And like the Apostle Paul, we are told she was caught up to the third heaven, to paradise, which is referred to as the dwelling place of God. And it was this first vision that she says she'd seen a better world, and it had spoiled her for this one. In coming back to this world, everything looked so dreary and dark compared to what she had just been privileged to see. Dear friends, there's a new day coming, and dawn is about to break, dispelling the darkness of this earth, and let me tell you what a wonderful day that's going to be. And these thoughts are reinforced in the following song that I'd like to share the words with you today. Listen very carefully to them. If you knelt beside the rubble of an aching, broken heart, if the things you gave your life to fell apart, you're not the first to be acquainted with sorrow, grief and pain. The Master promises you sunshine after rain. Hold on, my child, joy comes in the morning, weeping only lasts for the night. Hold on, my child, joy comes in the morning. The darkest hour that meets dawn is just in sight. To invest your seed of trust in God in mountains you cannot move, you've risked your life on things that you cannot prove. But to give the things you cannot keep for what you cannot lose is the way to find the joy that God has for you. Hold on, my child, joy comes in the morning. Weeping only lasts for the night. Hold on, my child, joy comes in the morning. The darkest hour that meets dawn is just in sight. Samuel Woodrow Tannehill was born 20th of June 1929 in Marion County, the United States of America. At the age of 5, his parents separated and he was cast adrift among well-meaning relatives and friends who offered to care for him. Unfortunately, his early life was not pleasant, happy or carefree, as would have been enjoyed by most other boys of his day. Sam lived in a dozen different homes before he reached his teenage years. His needs were basically ignored, and as a result he was to grow up maladjusted and starved for normal family affection. In some of the homes where Sam lived, he was treated cruelly by those who thought that they were teaching him obedience. Their harsh and unloving methods did absolutely nothing but arouse resentment in this desperately lonely boy. In his early teens, he was reunited with his father, who was at the time very ill. At the age of 15, the good and wholesome influence that he was receiving was cut short by his dad's untimely death. And once again, he was to be set adrift. He had a brilliant mind, but because of his insecurity and frequent moves, he never satisfactorily completed a single grade in school. At year 6, his formal schooling came to an end. And at no time during this period was he given any moral training, and he never had the opportunity of attending church. His criminal life really began about the age of 10 or 11, with minor infractions ultimately becoming major ones. It was thought that he would outgrow these antisocial tendencies, but his involvement in theft eventually led to a conviction of forgery, and he was sentenced to the Missouri State Penitentiary for 5.5 years. Within 3 weeks of his release, he was again committing crimes, and it was in his hometown of Fremont, Ohio, that he decided to pull his last job before leaving with a girlfriend for another state. His target was to be an all-night restaurant called The Hut. On duty at the time was a 29-year-old woman by the name of Mrs. Shirley Bradford. Deserted by her husband, she'd work nights to support herself and her little daughter. On entering the diner at 2 o'clock in the morning, armed with a gun, Sam's initial intention was just to take the money. But on the spur of the moment decided to take the woman with him so she wouldn't telephone the police. His plan was to release her outside of town, where it would take several hours for her to walk back before an alarm could be raised. Everything went terribly wrong, as the woman eventually recognised him and then informed him that she'd been a friend of his own sister. And after attempting to take his pistol, he picked up the car's jack and bludgeoned her with it. Her badly mutilated body was found next to the creek the following day. The manhunt was now on for Sam Tannehill. To cut a long story short, Sam Tannehill was caught and then sentenced on the 1st of February 1956 to die in the electric chair of the Ohio State Penitentiary. He was going to have to pay the ultimate price. However, before this could take place, Sam's life was to be turned upside down after a visit by 2 Seventh-day Adventist laymen from the Fremont Church. They'd read the news of his sentence in the local papers and were now requesting the sheriff for permission to visit with him in his cell. Now, Sam had not been a very cooperative prisoner in the county jail since his arrest, so their first request to see him was denied. But after praying that God would change this initial ruling, the men were finally given the opportunity to speak with him. Not being trained ministers, they delivered a very simple and a very earnest message emphasising the love of God and his desire to save. In the second visit, one of the men provided a Bible given by his 9-year-old son. And after enrolling him in the Faith of the Day Bible correspondence course, Sam's life was never to be the same again. While he sought forgiveness from those he had hurt, nothing he could ever do or say could undo the tragic consequences for Shirley Bradford's family. 6 dates were set for his execution. 5 of them passed by, but the 6th was to remain firm. Sam's execution was now set for 8 o'clock on the night of November 26, 1956. For many people, a killer was about to die. But as William A. Fagel from Faith of the Day was to note, the man that was to die in the chair was not the same man from a year and a half earlier. Jesus Christ had made such a change in his life that he was completely different. And during that period, he'd been visited by his mother and stepfather, and through the faithful witness of his changed life, had been given the privilege of seeing them accept Jesus and the knowledge of his soon coming. In Sam's last hours, he shared many favourite texts, but the one he often quoted was found in the second book of Timothy, chapter 4, and verses 7 and 8. And this is where Paul says, I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but unto all them that love his appearing. At 8 o'clock on November 26, William Fagel, representing the Seventh-day Adventist Church, along with a number of other witnesses, entered the grim death chamber of the Ohio State Penitentiary. 12 minutes had passed when the silence was to be broken by the soft voice of the tense prison doctor as he removed the stethoscope from the bare chest of the man that was seated before him. He took an official form from his pocket and he hesitantly pronounced, Warden Elvis, sufficient current has passed through the body of Tannehill to cause his death at 8:12 p.m. Sam Tannehill's life was to be a powerful example of the transforming grace of Christ. And while the first 26 years were to him a wasted life, his last year after accepting Jesus as his personal saviour was one he could have lived over and over and over again. The dark period of his life was now over, and he'd entered into the light of a new dawn with Jesus as his friend. You know, we're living in a time that for many people represents a dark period of Earth's history. And we look forward to the glorious dawn of a new beginning, a time when we're going to meet our Saviour face to face, and we will forever be with the Lord. This will indeed be a new day. Ever since the beginning of creation, the earth has moved slowly towards its date with destiny. Hold on, my child. Joy comes in the morning. Weeping only lasts for the night. Hold on, my child. Joy comes in the morning. The darkest hour that meets dawn is just in sight. Well, God bless you all.